First presentation, Finance Director.
This is the 20th year that the city has prepared an annual comprehensive financial report to date. All 19 previous annual financial reports were award winners. In our continued pursuit of excellence, this latest annual report will again be submitted for a certificate of achievement for excellence in financial reporting with the Government Finance Officers Association. The city's independent auditing firm, Allen Gibson Hulick, completed the audit of the 2013 financial records. Brian Holst, Vice President, Assurance of Allen Gibson Hulick, is here tonight to present the completed fiscal year 2023 audit to the governing body.
All right, I did bring a couple printouts here. I know these were in your agenda, but I never know what's going to be on your screen, especially when I bring PowerPoint. So I figured it might be easier to have it in front of you. Appreciate it. All right, so as Matt said, we're here to talk about the 2023 audit results tonight. And with that said, there were three things attached to your agenda packet. One was the opinion that goes in the financial statements. One was the governance letter, which is what I passed out. And then there was an internal control report that we'll talk about briefly later. So the first thing, which is what everybody always wants to know, is what's in the opinion. The opinion was unmodified. Since we are accountants and we don't use flowery language, that is the absolute best opinion you can get, which means great job, everything was good. We just are boring and say unmodified. So good job. But I think that's typically what everybody is looking for and kind of the main result of our audit. So I put it on here first. But with that said, then we'll go through the governance letter for most of what I'm up here to talk about. On page 1 of the governance letter, it lists out the date that we sent you the engagement letter, which was last October. That has a lot of the sort of details as far as what we were engaged to do, what we were going to do, what the city needs to do. And then also in March, we issued a planning letter that kind of went more into the detail about when we were going to be on site and those types of things. The main thing I wanted to point out here is that nothing changed from those letters, so everything kind of followed along the process that it should have, and that those are still valid. Also on page 1 of the governance letter is where we talk about any new standards or things that you were required to implement during the year. There was only one that had a significant impact this year, and it's GASB statement number 96, which is subscription-based information technology arrangements, which is terrible to say. So SPITA is the acronym that's been being used for that, which doesn't sound any better, but at least it's shorter. But the end result of that is that effectively it's the lease standard that you implemented last year just for software. So the rules are primarily the same. Any software agreements that you have that extend over multiple years, if you've got payments that you're making, you're now recording a right to use asset for that software offset with a liability for those payments that you're making. So you only had one, and it was about $450,000 this year. So that's new, it's in the financials, but it doesn't really substantially change anything. It's just kind of in the same section that the leases were last year. Other than that, the things that were new in this year were determined to not have a significant impact on the city. On the next page of the letter is where we talk about accounting estimates. And really we put that in there because there are a lot of things that aren't really black and white numbers. So things like your bank balance, we can send a letter to the bank and find out exactly how many dollars you have at the end of the year. But there's other things that require some sort of level of estimation. And the primary ones are your other post-employment benefits, your pension, and your allowance for uncollectible receivables. And there's a lot of information on that page in the letter that I'm not going to go through. The short version of that, though, is that for the first two, the city contracts with actuaries that calculate that number for you. And so we get copies of those reports and look through it all. With the allowance for uncollectible receivables, it's primarily based off of your historical collection trends. So we do point that out, though, because there are things that aren't quite as black and white, and want to make sure that that's drawn to everybody's attention. The other thing on that page then that we would normally list is any audit adjustments that were found, either ones that were posted or ones that were determined to not be significant enough to need to be posted. Fortunately, this year there were neither of those two things, so no adjustments identified and posted, nor ones that were determined not to need to be. The next slide here is really where we would talk about any issues or problems that came up as a result of the audit, which again, following on the theme that we've had so far of good news. As you're reading through all these bullet points, basically all they say is there were no issues that came up during the course of the audit. So nothing as far as timing, as far as dealing with management, as far as accounting things being recorded incorrectly. So again, big paragraphs, lots of words to basically say, we didn't have any issues, nothing was wrong with respect to those. This slide specifically is where I wanted to talk a little bit about the internal control report that was in your agenda packet. Didn't feel like we needed to print it out because, again, there weren't any findings or comments or issues that we needed to go over. But did want to just point out that there are things that we look at besides just the basic numbers themselves in the financial statements. So we are looking at internal control policies and procedures. We're looking at accounting treatments that might be able to kind of go one way or another depending on facts and circumstances. We're looking at all of the disclosures in your financial statements. We're looking at the estimates like we talked about earlier. And so that letter is where we would talk about, if we found issues with those internal control policies or if we found issues with compliance. And the fact that there weren't any, again, is good news, and also why I didn't feel like it was necessary to hand out the letter to go over today. So again, good news, no issues, no control problems that were identified as part of the audit or anything we needed to talk about today. This slide really is just listing out the new standards that are becoming effective over the next couple years, which right now is actually a fairly slow time. I think they were really pushing hard to get to 100, and then they slowed down a little bit on their new standards. And the compensated absence one here, number 101, is probably the only one that will really have much of an impact next year on your financial statements. And the short version of that is that your sick leave is probably what's going to be impacted the most. And historically, you only book it as a liability if you pay it out upon retirement or termination. What the standard is going to ask you to do now is see how much of that typically is used by those employees, regardless of whether they're being terminated or retiring. So it's going to go up a little bit probably, but how much is just kind of depend on the circumstances for every city. So it's not really going to change anything as far as how it's presented or disclosures, but there might be a slightly larger compensated absence liability next year. So other than that, though, nothing really big coming down at this point, like leases, for example, where it took a bunch of staff time to try to figure out what you were going to need to do and how to implement it. This one should be a little more straightforward with coming up with an estimate for how much is being used. And then once you have that, it should be about the same tracking as it is now. And then the last couple pages of our letter really are where we kind of point out a few different things that don't necessarily relate specifically to findings from your audit, but are just things that we put in to draw your attention to. And the first one there being cybersecurity risk. It really started becoming a big issue around COVID. So we're going on 4 years now since all of that happened, and it is definitely not slowing down. So we put it in all of our letters just to remind everybody about it, to kind of keep it in the forefront of your minds, especially when you're having budget discussions and things might come up about IT spending and stuff like that. It's only been a month or two since Kansas City had an issue. Jackson County had something not too long before that. My wife works at Liberty Hospital, which had something happen 6-8 months ago. So even the big entities with the huge IT budgets are running into these problems still. So again, nothing that we found in your audit that we wanted to bring out specifically, other than to just remind you that this is still an ongoing thing and still important to keep in mind. The policy and procedure review is really just more of some additional services that we can offer as a firm. There are definitely things like on the finance policy and procedure side where we would impair our independence if we were helping too much with evaluating those, but we have HR professionals that can do compensation studies and look at some other policies and procedures, things like that outside of sort of the finance scope. So it's really just kind of listing it in there. And then the final thing is a reference to our AGH University website, which has some webinars throughout the course of the year. For CPAs, it has continuing education credits, but it also just has some useful information out there and is a free resource that we have. So we always like to point that out at the end. So with that said, I think, again, nothing really concerning that we needed to go over today. I want to thank Matt and his department, probably especially Nancy and Jackie and Amy, who's not here, for fielding all of our questions throughout that process and making it go smooth. Nobody's ever excited when they hear an auditor's coming, but we certainly are appreciative when the finance department is cooperating with us and helping things go smooth. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any, but that was all I had for today.
Council, any questions? Nope. That's it. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you.
Matt, that went smoothly because